Hi, Dr. Dave Webster again. This is my follow-up blog to the one on Carol. This is where I said I would comment on what Dr. Margaret Chan would say. She was the Director General of the World Health Organization from 2006 to 2017, and here's what she had to say about my advocacy efforts for patients in Ontario. One thing that Margaret had said in the past and quoted was, "The WHO is the lead agency in health in the United Nations system. And clearly we have very important functions to play." Now, in fact, Dr. Chan handled many of the major world health crisis issues over her tenure, and that includes, but not just exclusively, SARS, avian influenza flu pandemic, and Ebola. Now, turns out Margaret was actually a classmate of mine. So, in October this year, I had the pleasure of meeting with Margaret again, and we were having our 40th anniversary of our privilege, quite frankly, to have been physicians in this province. Unfortunately, the politicians have made it less than joyful. Anyways, this is the University of Western Ontario Meds 77 class picture. This is actually Margaret and when she started, and this is David, her husband. They were married at the time, and this is me, of course, in the W section. Now, this is the front entrance to the University of Western Ontario Medical School, and we started there in 1973. And on that wall, just to the right, this was what we were greeted with in October. And this is a remarkable picture of Margaret that is very famous because of her undying and incredible support for health issues, particularly amongst women. Now, actually, that's Dave and Margaret way back in graduation with their little certificates there to be doctors in 1977, and this is in fact Margaret and David in October 2017, who I had the pleasure of again connecting with. Now, one thing, of course, Margaret understood more than anyone in Mid-77 is here she is meeting with President Putin, and he doesn't seem to be all that enthralled with seeing her. Here she's meeting with one of the North Korean diplomats, but what she knew was that what it was like to work with politicians and bureaucrats. And she did speak to us, and she had an opportunity to be quite candid because now she wouldn't be criticized for what she was saying about dealing with politicians now that she was no longer having to do so. So we sat there. I assure you, every member in the audience of our class were simply amazed and blown away. She was certainly the most eloquent speaker I have ever heard, and not a word was wasted, not a word was in her speech that shouldn't have been there and wasn't powerful. Anyways, during the time when she was there and I was talking with them, I did take Margaret aside, and I told her a little bit about my advocacy work for patients in Ontario. And what Margaret did, after she heard me, she looked me straight in the eye, and you knew you had 100% of Margaret's attention whenever she was talking to you. She put her hand on my arm, and she looked me straight in the eye. And Margaret asked me about one question. She said, "David, do you have the support of your colleagues?" And I responded, "No, Margaret, I don't." So then what did Margaret say to me? "David, you need to stop this right now. You need to protect your family, and you need to protect yourself." Think about that. The one thing Margaret didn't say to me was this: "Wait a minute, this is how the Ontario Liberals handle things and so on, but there's an election coming up. Who knows, maybe the Conservatives will handle things differently." I have offered to meet repeatedly with Mr. Patrick Brown, who may be our next premier, and I have actually met personally with Mr. Urick, a pharmacist from my own hometown. We went to the same high school. I'll have a lot more to say about this, but I'm not optimistic, to put it mildly. Oh, what about the NDP? People on my website have been saying, yes, but at least the NDP have forgotten, or have picked up the issue of PET because of their action in Ontario, in Sudbury. Don't even get me started on the party of the people. I'll have a lot to say about that. Anyways, over my years, I've really dealt with mostly the Ontario Liberals regarding PET. McGuinty was the first premier, and now I'm dealing, of course, with Premier Wynne, and of course, their Ministers of Health. The first one I dealt with was Mr. George Smitherman, aka Furious George, and he was very proud of being McGuinty's bulldog and in charge of making healthcare decisions. Now, here he is in a classic political, situation. He's either kissing babies or sucking up to these older ladies and telling them what a wonderful thing he's doing for them, and so on. In reality, Mr. Smitherman would block everyone from access to PET, which was already the standard of care in Chile and Argentina and various places like that. And he would dismiss the 2005 motions from the Canadian Association of Nuclear Medicine, which remarkably declared these trials unethical. He just simply outright dismissed them. Now, and then another Minister of Health was Ms. Deb Matthews. In fact, she is now our Deputy Premier. Now, one of the people I'm going to talk about extensively in my videos, and what has really been part of my motivation to try, and inspired me, quite frankly, is Mr. Sam Bruno, a remarkable man from Sudbury who unfortunately would die from colon cancer. But I mean, this man and his family are simply an absolute model for what we would think that citizens are capable of in this province. Sadly, the people he was dealing with in the political market weren't quite of that caliber. Bottom line is, I'll go into more detail, but Ms. Matthews would actually send her Sam out for real special attention, and then when he died, she will publicly insult him when he can't have a chance to respond. So, this is our current Minister of Health, Dr. Eric Hospins. Now, as a doctor, we at least have one thing in common. We all have to take the Hippocratic Oath, which in part says, first, do no harm to your patients. And we'll go over the letter where Dr. Hoskins will assure me how proud he is of what Cancer Care Ontario and their master colleagues have done to our patients. Now, what else Margaret didn't say to me was this: well, maybe you should try dealing with the Ontario Ombudsmen. I mean, they're the watchdogs, aren't they? They're there to prevent the abuse of citizens from government, aren't they? Well, this is our current ombudsman, Mr. Paul Dubé, and an interesting guy interviewing him here. This is Mr. Steve Paikin. If anybody's ever heard of him on the show called The Agenda, he turns out to be one of the top paid news anchors, in Canada. Anyone for a moment not know that Mr. Paikin knows every last detail but won't touch this story? So, this is the Ontario Ombudsman website. You notice it says Ontario's Watchdog. The first one I dealt with Mr. Andre Morin. I actually ran two investigations into PET sort of with him, and I'll go through that in another video. But the bottom line is, after all the work that was done, Mr. Morin will dismiss all the accounts and concerns raised by Canadian and international PET experts in their condemnation of what was happening. Not only that, he will publicly congratulate the Cancer Care Ontario and the government for what they're doing for PET. And guess what? He'll bury his investigations from public access, and the reason he will give me is, well, he didn't think there'd be any value in releasing this investigation to the public. Now, guess what? There's Sam Bruno again, and you'll see what an important role he plays in PET in Ontario. But Mr. Moran, I will show you how he goes out of his way to make sure to silence Mr. Bruno for his efforts to get PET in Ontario. So currently we have Mr. Paul Dubé, and this is Ms. Barb Finley. She's the Deputy Minister of Health, and I've actually dealt with her before because she's been in that department, I think, since 2005. So what I did actually a year ago was I approached Mr. Dubé and Ms. Finley, and I said, listen, I want you to consider whether or not Mr. Andre truly acted as a watchdog against government abuse of patients. They basically concluded exactly what Mr. Moran was. They dismissed all the concerns, would again, as Mr. Moran did, insult my intelligence, professionalism, and that of my colleagues. Yet when I said, okay, that's fine, for my statements and documents I've given you, I want you to back your statements. How did you come to that conclusion? Please, and point those points out. They have absolutely refused to respond to me with registered letters and so on. So, the question: when you're looking at people like McGuinty and Wynne, are Ontario ombudsmen's watchdogs, or are they lapdogs? I'm going to give you lots of information so you can help make up your own minds. So what also Margaret didn't say to me was, David, well, look, this is Ontario. At least you live in this free and open place where you will not have to live in fear, and you will be encouraged to act as an advocate for Ontario's patients. She did not say that. What Margaret did say, remember, was this: David, you need to stop this right now. You need to protect your family. You need to protect yourself. In other words, we in Ontario do need to fear our government and those that keep them in power, particularly if you happen to be a patient in this province. So, one thing I'm going to ask you to consider over my video blogs, and this may sound like an outrageous comparison initially, but maybe you'll come along to believe what I've learned after 35 years of dealing with politicians. This is Mr. Robert Mugabe, president of Zimbabwe, oldest president in the world, and this is the Minister of Health. And we all know about Mugabe and these people. But really, at the most fundamental and basic level, are our politicians, their bureaucrats, and those that benefit from keeping these people in power really any different? My conclusion after almost 40 years of dealing with politicians is it's simply a matter of degree. It's not a matter of difference in style or personality types. So, here's an announcement from the CBC on how Ontario's 2018 election campaign will be different than 2014. Now, does anyone over the age of a child not know that every CBC media form and at every level has known about all of what I'm telling you and more since the very beginning? So the only way we are ever going to get any change here is if we simply have to get this critical issue of forcing Ontario doctors to practice incompetent medicine and making victims out of our patients. We simply have to make this as a key issue of discussion during the next election. And goes without saying, we're going to have to do this in spite of the best efforts of our so-called trusted sources of news and information. And how we're going to do that that's only going to be accomplished by using social media on steroids. So we have the power, the tools, and the opportunity to make these politicians earn the trust and respect that they actually expect from voters. So in my next blog, it's not just enough for me to complain and give you all these facts and truth. I really need to offer some solutions, and obviously you might guess I've done this repeatedly with the government and have been rejected. But what I'm going to talk about in that next video is proposed solutions to not just a better, more humane, and believe it or not, actual patients first healthcare system, but in reality, cheaper to the taxpayer. And in addition, I'm going to lay out sort of what I hope is a plan of how to accomplish these ambitious goals, which after 15 years I've totally failed so far. But I'm going to hopefully be able to, with your help, finally get our patients access to medicine, which has in fact been the standard of care in places like Chile and Argentina for almost 20 years. And above all, I'm going to be looking to you, the people who are watching these videos and following me on my social media, to come up with your suggestions and guidance. And so if we have any chance of finally forcing our politicians to be open, transparent, and accountable, I need all the help I can and your suggestions and comments and criticisms. So look forward to talking to you in my next video. Thank you.